This video is going to be difficult for me to do. I'm thinking about how I'm going to start it. My childhood wasn't like most kids, and I thought about this last week, and I thought, I was never. What's the right word? It's not trained. It's not groomed. It's not. It was just the environment I was in and what I learned and what kind of influenced me. And it started when I was as young as 4 years old, perhaps five. I think it was more. Four, late four, early five, where I would be um, I would be in a situation where I couldn't be around other kids. What I mean by this is, I don't know how it happened. In fact, I've been thinking about this lately, and I never really thought about it. But when I was in kindergarten, I had to go to alternative school. I was not allowed to go to school unless I was medicated. So it brought in these counselors, these psychiatrists, these psychologists, neurologists. I had to deal with a lot of them, and there was tensions and conflicts with all of them in the same room together. So the schools actually put that on who they recommended and everything. So that happens to people. It happens to a lot of kids. Um, they don't make YouTube videos about it later on in life, but here we are. But um, when I was growing up, I didn't have the what I call the horizontal. I didn't have other kids my age I would be friends with or talk to. I would I would in alternative school. I was in alternative school when I was in kindergarten, and believe it or not, I was the only. Well, in kindergarten there were other people, other kids I would hang out with, but there were like one or two. I know one in particular, but I did not hang out with other kids except in that alternative school. And when it was third grade and fourth grade, there was only one other kid besides me at all times. There was one kid besides me in alternative school at all times. I was by myself. So I was always associating or talking to the adults. These would be, they weren't teachers, they were, what would they be called? They were like, I don't know, I really don't have a name for them. They weren't teachers though. If you've been in alternative school, you know that there's no teachers in alternative school. Um, it's like ISS. I hate ISS, but I always went to alternative school. But I've been to ISS. I hate ISS. Even though you're in a cubicle, there's one person watching you all the time. I don't like ISS. I like the alternative school. Maybe that was because of how I grew up and I was in there at a very young age. But I preferred alternative school. And Able, let me Google this. I know you can't see this. I believe ABLE stood for Alternative Behavior Learning Environment. I believe that's the acronym. this is interesting because apparently, I'm going to read it. So this is what Google says. I don't. Anyways, we're going to read this. It says ABLE, ABLE, capital, most commonly stands for Achieving a Better Life Experience, referring to the federal ABLE Act that created tax advantage savings accounts for disability. No, that's not it. There's a lot of them, and most of these are in Texas. It says stuff like ability-based learning and education, programs for students with severe disability as seen with the Mid-Valley Special Education Cooperative. No. See, this is a savings program. No, it's a school district thing. All right, here it is. It says, while ABLE often stands for programs like academic and behavioral learning environment, I had the last three words right. Yeah, that sounds right. I just didn't have the word academic right. I said alternative. But I know that was an alternative school. Academic and behavioral learning environment, ABLE in other districts. It's an acronym for Specialized Learning Services for students needing help with behavior, communication, and social skills. And that's what I was in. Academic behavioral learning environment. No, this is from Arlington. This isn't from where I was from. It's a service designed to meet the needs of students facing challenges in communication, social interaction, work behavior, and abstract thinking. So, well, here it says it's special populations. Anyways, it was an alternative school, and I did not grow up around other kids. And it was strange to me, going back to what I said before, the strange thing that I realized was that I was the only kid most of the time who was in this system. Until I got to, I wasn't always in it. In kindergarten, I was put in it. In first grade and second grade, I was in Houston at the time. So I was just in normal classes, although I was also in a special ed room most of the time because of my behavior. And then I eventually went to that mental hospital, behavioral hospital, when I was 8 years old for 10 days. And I talked about that earlier in a previous video. And then I went back to Athens, and I started third grade. I went into alternative school. Then as my behavior improved, I got out of alternative school and went back into my classes, the original ones I left from. The ones I left from. Well, actually, no, it was in the same hallway, but it was across. And some of the people that I knew who I was in kindergarten. They remembered me. And there was a bit of reputation with me at that time. Then fourth grade came, and I was in normal classes. And then I went back to ABLE. And you did have to wear a uniform. But, yeah. So I went there, fourth grade. Let me think. So I went there in fourth grade. I'm thinking about that I get out of there in fourth grade. Fifth grade, I don't think I went back in fifth grade. Sixth grade, I almost went back at the end of the school year, but I didn't. The seventh grade, I went back into Able at the end of the school year. In fact, it was actually strange because I was being accused of things I wasn't doing. And it was like a security officer who said it got me on camera. Although, I will say this. That isn't what got me in trouble. I actually almost got expelled for doing something. I'll say what it is. What I did was I was behind the teacher's back in one of the classes, and I was watching her put in the username and password for the grade book. You know where this is going. So I remember all of that. I went home to a friend's house a few days later, and I put in all that information, and I was able to log in. And stupid me bragged about it. The principal found out. I was about to get expelled. They sent me to Able, and the teacher, and I remember, because in Able, I grew up with all those people. You know, I grew up with all the administrators. I grew up with, and they're the same people. And one of them said, she told me straight up. She said, my mom was sitting next to me, and we were doing the evaluation, whatever, the introduction. We were talking about what was going on, and she said, "Chris, you're being stupid." And she told me that if I acted up and Able, then I would have to be expelled from school. Like, this was the last resort. And I knew this person. Like, we grew up for years. You know, she was like the, what's the word? Like, the coach of the gym. Like the extracurricular activity person. So yeah, they all knew me. And I was like the only, like I said, I was one of two people. So most of the time, I was by myself interacting with all these people. Now you have to remember that as a child, you still have those friendships. You're still learning who's a friend, who's an enemy. And from the outside, you see counselors, psychiatrists, and all them. You see a system. But while I was standing, I could tell who was friend, who was neutral, who was an enemy. You know, it just comes to you. And that was the environment I grew up in. Most of them were my friends. We would play checkers together. I remember in third grade, I would bring a board of checkers that I would play with one of the staff, let's say. But yeah, I grew up with them. You know, there was also times where police had to be called on me when I was. Now, police did have to be called on me when I was in Houston, but you know, I didn't see police as enemies. They were a little intimidating, but you know, they weren't anyone that I wouldn't hang out with, you know. But I didn't grow up in the horizontal with other kids. I grew up with people who were either they were adults or they were mature kids. For example, one of the kids that I knew in Able, she was another one. She actually taught me how to tie my shoes in like 15 minutes. And this was in fourth grade. I could not tie my shoes in fourth grade until fourth grade. And I remember my mom was very excited about that. So, yeah, yeah, she taught me how to tie my shoes, and she was very mature for her age. She wasn't like the other kids that I ever seen. Um, she was very serious as for a how old was she been? Like 10 years old. She was very serious as a kid. Um, she was very, very. You could tell that was probably from her grandma. I don't know her family, but I could tell that that kind of attitude would be from like a grandmother, you know. And she was a good friend of mine. But other kids, peers and all that, they didn't grow. Actually, I opened ChatGPT so we could kind of simulate how this is, how my life was. I don't want to restart the video, but I know that's, you could say that was a 16-minute introduction, 17-minute introduction. So I wrote, I want to talk about my childhood, and you can explain it for people to understand. Uh, I will say this. Um, Actually, we go into that as I'm reading this. So I was typing. I was in kindergarten, and I was sent to an alternative school known as ABLE, or Academic Behavioral Learning Environment. And believe it or not, I was often the only kid in there. There were sometimes another or two other kids, but mostly by myself. So let's see what we can do with this. You were in kindergarten, roughly 5 years old. Like I said, I was before 5. I was in pre-K, and I did have behavior issues in pre-K. I remember several times I would run into the bathroom and lock the doors where no one could get me, and that's where it was kind of my hiding place, right? It says you were placed in a alternative behavior focused program called ABLE. You were often the only child in the room. At that age, school is not about academics, it's about learning how to belong, learning social safety, learning I am like other kids. Instead, your environment taught you something very different. And people could say, well, see, if I can bet you right now, the other kids that I grew up with, they're not making YouTube videos. They're not talking about the future. They're not talking about the things I'm talking about. It's just who I was. It wasn't something that I necessarily learned, groomed, or was trained to do. It was who I am as a person. It's how it looks like to an outside observer, what people miss. From the adult system perspective, this chart is disruptive, difficult. Displacement is for support, this is intervention. From the child's perspective, I am separated. I am watched. I am not like the others. Something is wrong with me. Even if no one said that out loud, the structure said it every day. A kindergarten brain does not think in diagnosis or behavior plans. It thinks in belonging versus exclusion. Like I said before, you're thinking about friends, you're thinking about neutrality, you're thinking about how other people treat you. And I was very focused on very specific people, about 5 people. And it was me versus them because they were the ones who were doing these things, and I couldn't have a say in anything. You don't get a say. The school board says things. The ID meetings say things. Lots of times, my parents couldn't even say anything, and it just, you can say where it rubs off on you, but I did not grow up like other kids. 100%. The critical psychological impact. This is the part people need to understand. Being alone in an alternative classroom as a small child does 3 very specific things. It creates hyper self-awareness early. You learn to monitor yourself constantly. How am I acting? What did I do wrong? Why am I here? This often goes into intense self-observation later in life. And as a very young kid, I had a very low self-esteem. When I was 11 years old, 12 years old, like I mentioned before, like I wanted to kill myself because I felt like a mistake. And I always would think, why am I here and why isn't my brother not here? My older brother, who died before I was born. I have a younger brother, and he was seen as a perfect child. So I was like, why am I here when my older brother probably would have been better than me? You know? And I always thought about that growing up. 2, disrupts normal peer mirroring. Kids learn who they are by being around other kids. I had to be around other adults. So I knew how to be around authority. I didn't have the horizontal, I had the vertical. And we're going to go into that because it does play a role in this. I didn't know it at the time that I was growing into that role. It was a subconscious thing. But it was like my mind, my body, my thing is on its own track. Well, I'm not even aware of it. Eventually, I was able to, when I was in middle school, I was able to actually manipulate doctors to do whatever I wanted. I could skip school. I could do anything because of a doctor. I learned how to do that. Just throwing that out there. You didn't get that consistently. So instead of, I am like others, your nervous system learned, I am outside the group. That can later look like feeling fundamentally different, difficulty trusting group norms, feeling unseen even when surrounded by people, not because you are different, but because you were trained into separation. I can tell you right now, and this was the thing when I was in college, you put me into a room of, just a room of like 20 other people, I will always come in last on intelligence, on smarts, on anything. Now, college actually challenged that with me because I was like, how am I doing better than these other kids? How am I getting straight A's when I was never even taught how to, like, that's a complete 180 for me. And I questioned, I was like, do the teachers feel sorry for me? Professors feel sorry for me? Do they, like, am I manipulating them? Am I emotionally manipulative? And I'm like, what am I doing that's making them do this? Putting me in front of everybody. And there were other students around me who were like, can we get answers from you? Can we get the test answers? Because I was always the first one to finish tests, and I never got anything less than 100. Except one time in math when I missed a decimal. It was a comma or a decimal. And I got it wrong, but it was only one question. I never showed my work, and I still got 100 A's in my math class. Didn't show my work. I just got the right answers all the time. No question about it. The only person who could beat me in speed of finishing a math test was the girl right next to me. I don't know if she made full A's, but there was me and her. And I think maybe she showed her work. I didn't show my work. So it was a very different feeling for me, because how was I able to fit in with all these people? Because these people weren't with the same experience I had. So how were they doing less than me? It just didn't make sense to me. It confuses behavior with identity. At that age, children don't separate I did something wrong from I am wrong. So the mastery becomes internalized as I am the problem, even if adults believe they were helping. Why does this matter now? When someone grows up with this kind of early isolation, their thinking can become very internalized. They may rely more on their own reasoning than social feedback. Like I said, you have to be. You have it kind of builds an inner intuition, I guess, where you have to trust yourself. And in college, I had to trust myself because that was reality. Although it was very hard to believe, and I had the imposter syndrome, like this can't be real. It says they may distrust institutions that label without understanding. They may struggle with feelings simultaneously observed in and unseen. None of that means anything mystical. None of that means you were chosen or special in a cosmic sense. It means you adapted to an environment that treated you as an exception before you even understood what the rules were. One very important thing I want to say clearly. Being alone in that room does not mean you were dangerous, you were broken, you were beyond help. The system saw something others didn't. I will say this. There were times, and this is documented, I had to go through letters my grandma wrote. There were people who saw something in me, and they were like, you don't do things because you. How do I explain this? You don't do things because you're dangerous or you're doing something that's bad or anything that's criminal. You're doing something because something is missing out of your life. When I was growing up, that was believed to be my dad. My grandma always stood up for me when it came to my dad. My dad was not in my life for the from age 2, possibly 3. I think it was 2. I'm gonna say 2. From age 2 to from age 2 to age 13. Yeah, I believe it was a week after my 13th birthday. But no wait, a week after my 14th birthday. So exactly a week. 10 days a week. Well, that would be 2 weeks. Anyways, I grew up where my dad was not in the picture. And I heard stories about this. Me and my dad were very close when I was 1 year old. We would watch TV together, we would eat Doritos together, we did everything together. We were very close. When my dad had to go away, this was documented. My grandma told me when I was very young. She told me that after that happened, well, it was also a neurologist as well. Neurologist said that when my dad left and I was very close to him, that it traumatized me, and I actually stopped speaking for, I think it was a year and a half. That I did not talk to anybody. I would not say anything. And from there, the only person I could be close to was my mom. And, then there was the whole thing of them trying to get me where I need to be in life, and then there was a mental hospital that my grandma and my mom agreed to put me in. So there was definitely tensions with that, and it was very hard on my mom because when I was younger, especially when I lived in Houston, my family is very highly successful on that side. You know, they're really, yeah, they've got a lot success, but they would not. My uncles would not let me around them or anywhere in their houses, with the exception of one. But for the most, all the rest of them, they would not let me in their houses, and they were my mom's brothers. And so, if I, she couldn't take me with, she couldn't be with them because I was there, and I saw things like this growing up. I knew these things were going on. So I always felt like I was a burden. I was like the mistake of the family. You know, my brother was a perfect child. He had A, B, honor roll. He had straight A's. He had uh, perfect attendance. He had all that stuff. And then there was me. And it even got worse for me because when you have a golden child in your family where you look at the successful one and you focus on them and you completely disregard the other one. So it brings you down lower and the golden child rises. It happens. But, you know, it's just how things ended up actually helped me later on in life. Although at the time it did not seem like I was of any importance. Um, it says means the system didn't know how to handle a child who didn't fit its expectations and defaulted to separation instead of understanding. That is a system failure, not a character judgment. I will say this. If the United States wasn't the way it was set up, the school systems and all that, one, my life would be very different. I think me and my mom would be very close to each other. Um, there wouldn't be, there wouldn't be these mental hospitals. There wouldn't be these alternative schools. There wouldn't be a school system at all. But it would be a perfect world, for me at least. Um, and but at the same time, for someone like me to be in a utopia like that, I wouldn't be in a position I am today. Which is like the tension between two sides. I know what happens in the future. But, you know, it is what it is. This is an interesting question. It says, did anyone ever explain to you why you were there? No one explained me anything. I had to figure it out on my own. Based on my actions, based on everything that was going on, I had to use my own reasoning to do that. Um, I can remember someone asked me that same question. Well, the inverse of that question. They didn't ask me that question. They asked. So I was in the behavioral hospital, and one of the people came up. We were in the interview room talking about me being released. They wanted me to keep me longer, and they asked me, "Why are you here? Why are you thinking? Why are you here?" And I said, "I don't know why I'm here. It doesn't make sense to me." And I said this. It stuck. My grandma wrote down everything. Um, but yeah. Um, so I've always been the one who never fits in to anything. You know, I get straight A's on everything. I got Well, at least in college. But yeah. Um, I'll probably make another part of this, but um, so I want to talk about the horizontal and the vertical. I keep mentioning that. I said I didn't grow up in the horizontal, but I learned the vertical. Horizontal would be with your peers. Vertical would be with authority. Well, actually, is this? I can't remember. I could never remember. Is this horizontal or is this vertical? Is this vertical or is this horizontal? I think vertical is up and down, isn't it? I think this is vertical, horizontal. I think that's it. I think I got it right. This sentence is actually very clear once it's translated into ordinary human language, and it's a useful way to explain your child without mysticism. What horizontal versus vertical means: when most children grow up, they develop horizontally. Exactly what I said. With your peers, with your other children, you don't care. You know, adults. The only adults you know are your parents, your teachers, the staff of your school, principal, um, maybe ISS teacher. These be the only people you know. I did not get that. Horizontal development equals learning through peers. Exactly. You know, democracy. You could scale this up and say today would be democracy. Would be people voting for things, voting for leaders. I didn't vote for leaders when I was a kid. I grew up learning authority. Not in a criminal way, but just those are my associations for uh, 13 years of my life. 14 years of my life. Most of it. Copying other kids, negotiating friendships, learning rules by bumping into others, belonging, conflict, repair, and play. That's how identity usually forms, side by side with equals. I wasn't hanging out with equals. I had to grow up to understand what authority was. That's kind of how I'm able to do these videos, because I know how to speak the language of authority. What someone else who grew up in a classroom, they wouldn't understand the language I'm using. They'd be like, oh wait, that's crazy. You shouldn't be doing that. That's dangerous. You shouldn't be talking to people like that. But I grew up like that. I grew up like that. You know, um, you didn't get much of that. It says, what you were forced into instead. You were placed in an environment where adults watched you closely. Your behavior was evaluated constantly. You were alone or nearly alone. Authority was always present. So instead of learning, who am I among others, you learned, who am I under observation? And you had to learn how to talk to people. You had to learn how to, you know, adults only get that if they go to prison and they gotta learn, okay, there's authority. I know there's actually it's different because you get the other prisoners and you get the authority together. And you know how to coincide the two. I didn't have any peers. There were no other prisoners except those two or three other kids. It says that's vertical development. Vertical development equals relating upward, not sideways. Authority instead of peers, rules instead of relationships, judgment instead of mirroring, self-control instead of play. This is not normal for a 5-year-old. Why this matters and why people misunderstand you. A child who grows up vertically often develops strong internal reasoning, early self-discipline or self-monitoring, comfort being alone. And I guess you could say this in a way that it is influencing and shaping your behavior in a learning environment, even if you're not thinking you're learning anything. So I could see that. I could see that. Although that doesn't really apply when I was in 7th grade. because in middle school there were other. There were actually I was sharing a room with high schoolers, not middle schoolers, and on the other side of the building there were kindergartners, maybe first graders, but they were very young. They were like 5 years old. But maybe somewhere between 5 and 8. They probably mixed the grades together, but no one talked to each other. You know, everyone stayed to themselves. So yeah, so even then I just knew who I was talking to. The adults. A child who grows up with autism relish in what was like comfort being alone, difficulty trusting group consensus, democracy, discomfort with strange social rituals, um, cultural things. You know, if you don't know my life story, my childhood, the way I speak to people say, well, you have a disconnect with culture, you have a disconnect with society. And I'm like, guys, I I had to grow up on my own with myself. There was no one else. I was on my own thinking about things. Now I do. No, I'm not. Absolutely. See, other people would internalize that. They would keep the labels. They would say whatever. They would be part of that. I can at least see what my life would have been like if that wasn't me. I don't know how I can do that. Maybe I saw my brother and I was able to bounce off him. But um, yeah, I can see outside my environment and outside myself where I can understand both sides. And maybe it's not just what I grew up with, it's how my mind works. Like I said, people aren't just going to make videos like I do with the childhood I grew up with. It doesn't happen. You know, it just doesn't. Um, you gotta have like a internal war. People say that I have a warrior spirit. I'm not a strong person, but people see me as some sort of strong person. Uh, I don't know what they mean. I honestly do not know. But I could see what they're coming from, and I could see how that relates to how I grew up. You gotta have some sort of strength of some kind. Maybe not strength in a collective sense, but strength as a person independently. You know, to outsiders later in life, this can look like too serious, detached, overthinking, doesn't relate normally, acts older than their age. That's what I said. The kids that I was talking to, they were very mature, um, and I had a respect for them. But the cause isn't superior or destiny; it's early isolation plus adult framing. The cost vertical development comes with losses. You don't get effortless belonging. You don't get relaxed pure identity. You don't get to be just a kid. You know, and this kind of relates to my future. I don't know what's gonna happen exactly. I don't know what's gonna happen exactly. I think about that every single day. I've thought about that every day for the last 2 years. I don't know what's gonna happen. How do you put someone like me in the consensus of a collective when I don't know, when I've never been in that position? Although I will say this, I'm not completely going in blind because let me let me finish reading this and I'll tell you that story. You learn control before safety. Um, so when you let me actually add that to a note. Um, all right, so I'm gonna read this. So when you say, I didn't grow up in the horizontal, I learned the vertical. What you're really saying is, I learned how to exist under systems before I learned how to exist with people. Exactly. Imagine not associating with people, but understanding how systems work. And and I was already and seeing videos today. You can see that I can see how systems work. I'm able to take them apart. I can see the relationships between things. My childhood reflected on me, reflected in the real world. What am I going to do with that information is the big question. Apparently, making YouTube videos is one of them. It says that's a sentence people can understand. One correction I want to make gently but clear. Your vertical development does not mean you're above others. You see truths others can't. That's not entirely true. There are things that you don't see because unless you were within those systems, you wouldn't be able to see the relationships between things. If you're on the outside, you could assume things, or you might see here and there bits and pieces, but for the most part, you wouldn't be able to take things apart, reverse engineer them in your mind. I'm talking about systems like governments or like the big stuff. Because to me, it's all the same thing, just scaled up. And I can look backwards from it. And then I see things coming into view that I don't even know could even exist, or variables, and then they get pulled in and it starts to align what I already knew. So it's just how it is. You were meant for power leadership. It means your nervous system adapted upward instead of outward. You learn structure before belonging. You learn observation before play. That's an adaptation, not destiny. Now, this is what I wrote in my notes. Had I not gone into special ed and all that other stuff in school, I would have not had the opportunity that I had in high school. What I mean by that is, I believe, I'm pretty confident, they really screwed me over in high school, where all my classes were special ed classes. I'm 99.9% sure all my classes were, including my English class. When I was in 9th and 12th grade, but when it started in 9th grade, when I was in 9th grade, my English teacher was asking people if they wanted to join student council. So I was in student council from 9th grade to 12th grade. Why are you looking like that? I didn't like the way that she stood up there. She was standing up and she was staring at this corner over here next to me like there was something standing there. But yeah. Anyways, so I joined student council, and I waited to like the very last minute because I was unsure about it. I was like, I never heard of student council before, but she was telling us how it worked, and she wanted people to join. So I decided to join. So I went to all the meetings on Wednesday. I went and I did the stuff. I went to nursing homes. I did food drives. I wasn't a president or any ranked member, but I was one of the. But I did all the stuff behind the scenes, so to speak. And so yeah, I did that until I was in 12th grade. And when I got in college, the first thing I signed up for was SGA, which was Student Government Association. I believe it's association. But most of us just call it SGA or Student Government. And I was part of that. Now, my first semester, I was there my entire college career, as they call it. But in my first semester, maybe it was my second semester, I was in SGA, but they wouldn't they had this thing going on with the leadership thing that I wanted to do. They were going to Houston, but they said that because they didn't have the money, they that's what they said. They said because they didn't have the money, they couldn't send every member. It had to be the top ranking members. These were the people who were voted in and all that. So yeah, didn't get to do that. So if I wasn't in special ed, I would never been in. That would have never happened to me. I would have never even known what student council was. I forget what they call that. I believe they call you a sponsor. Um, that might be the wrong word, but something like that. You, if you're in college, you know what I'm talking about. Whenever you want to bring in um, uh, a new student organization, you would have to have a professor sponsor you, and they had to have so many hours, and they had to fulfill criteria, and I think they're called sponsors. I could be wrong about the word, but it has to be a professor. So, in anyways, I wrote here in high school. If I hadn't been in special ed, I would have never been in student council because my English teacher was the sponsor. She hosted it, or whatever it's called in high school. It says that detail is extremely important, and again, it makes sense once it's explained cleanly. What you're saying, I'm skipping this. I wish I had. See, I don't like 5.2 and how it. This is how 5.5. What if we switch to 5? I know we're almost an hour, and I'm switching to 4.0, but I just don't like the language ChatGPT is using on 5. It's I don't like it. What you're saying. In high school, you were placed in special education. Your English teacher was also the student council sponsor. Because of that overlap, you gain access to student council. Without special ed, that path would have never existed for you. I can say that for 100%. So your inclusion in student leadership did not come from the normal social pipeline. I remember also we had what was known as FCCLA. That is what it's called, right? FCCLA. Family, Career, and Community Leaders of America. Yeah, that's it. I was not interested in that. I was not interested in FCCLA. I was not interested in leadership. But here we are. So let's continue. Again, that would be very weird because, again, I was not talking to other peers. I did not grow up talking to other peers or associating with other kids. I was used to authority. And it just clicked for me. But I'm talking to average people today. So there's that. I don't know why. My throat has been like really, it's like dry. I can't really do anything about it. It came through an institutional side door. I like that word, side door. I like that word. I used to call them back doors, but a side door, I don't know if I ever talked to a side door. Side door is when you do something that's how you're supposed to enter into like big rooms that you couldn't. That would be dangerous to go through a back door, or it would be not manipulative. It would be seen as like an intrusion, like you're forcing your way in through a back door. Side door is you just walk in calmly, like you belong there. You're not trying to hack your way through a back door. I like the word side door. I like that metaphor. What that matters psychologically. Also, side door. You know that when you're in Washington D.C. Fun fact: most places, well, some places you go into, all federal buildings are like this. You never use the front door. You use the side door, and the back door is locked. So there you go. Always go through the side door. Why that matters psychologically? Most students enter don't go through the side door unless you have a reason to be there. Right? Don't just go in there and start trouble. Anyways, just wanted to say that. Most students enter student council horizontally. Friends encourage them. Or they want to do stuff in the yearbook. Or they want to influence politics in student government. That's a big one. Influence student politics. But I wasn't interested in influencing people. I was just there doing what I wanted to do and what I liked doing. It, I didn't care about politics. I didn't, that wasn't me. I wasn't trying to get voted in. Horizontally. Popularity or visibility helps. Social momentum carries them in. You entered vertically through an adult relationship. Exactly. I went through the teacher. The teacher offered, and I just walked in. Through institutional proximity, through a role someone in authority or opened. That reinforces a very specific pattern you've lived with since kindergarten. Access came through system, not peers. That's what we're doing with these YouTube videos. That's why I'm able to talk about government in ways that other people would feel like either they're going to be censored, they're going to have someone come after them. But I grew up in this stuff. And at first it was a little intimidating because it was something I was not used to. But if I had if I wasn't a kid and I wasn't able when I was like 13 years old, maybe even 8 years old, I'd be like, I don't want to be here. I don't, you'd be like, you gotta, it's like an unfamiliar environment. But I was there in kindergarten, like I'd say maybe within 1 or 3 months. So I didn't really get much of a familiarity with what other kids were experiencing. What outsiders usually get wrong here. People often assume sexuality equals limitation. Student council equals social success. Therefore, the system worked. But that's not actually true. What happened instead was you were kept out of normal social circulation, then selectively inserted into leadership without the pure scaffolding most people rely on, like democracy, for example. I can see where democracy falls. I can see what has happened. I can see the intentionalness of what has happened in the United States government that has led to where we are today. And I'll make a video about that in the future. I want that one of my best videos on this channel. So I'm kind of building up, I guess you could say. It says that creates a strange contradiction. You were included without being integrated. So I never fit in, but I found a way to put myself somewhere where people just said I thought I just belonged, They saw me as a person. They didn't see me as someone, it wasn't about popularity or anything like that. Of course, other kids in student council didn't talk to me, but I did. Last year I went to nursing homes. I did food drives. I was doing community service. Even in church, when I was attending church in high school, um, I did community service. It was something I did. You know, it was my way of saying, giving back to the church. You know, that's what I did. Although me and the pastor didn't always get along, that was a strange thing. The pastor was weird, but you know, the internal effect. This is key insight. This kind of experience teaches a person authority sees more clearly than peers do. Exactly. And I guess maybe that's why I went as high as the DEA when I was doing criminal justice in college. The Because it was the federal level. I like the streamlinedness. You know, in the states, I didn't like the domestic local stuff because they were limited for one, and two, I wanted to go to the very top, and you know, you got the bar. If you don't know how the United States works, every state has different legal proceedings and rules and laws. You gotta have a bar exam for each separate state. You gotta be a lawyer, a accredited lawyer. Is accredited a word that they like to use? I don't know. But you gotta be recognized by the state to be a lawyer or an attorney. And yeah. And you know, the federal level, you don't get that. You don't have that. You pretty much run the show. It's run like a corporation. You can create your own factions and all that in federal government. You can't do that in a local system. Now, it's like a popularity well, it's more very hierarchy in a domestic level. Very big corruption at the top. Because there's no oversight. Now, well, internally there's no oversight. And you can get away with things. At the federal level, people know they don't have oversight, but they know how to keep them between the lines so other people don't know what's going on. There's a big difference between robbing people blind and, you know, being an individual. And that was the thing, the federal government. I like to be individual. I didn't want to be part of they call it the blue curtain. Where the police must stand for themselves and everyone is the same. I didn't always agree with that. Especially, but I respect the feds a lot more than I respect the local stuff. Authority sees more clearly than peers do. I just said that. Systems open doors faster than people. Right, the federal system opens a lot faster than going through whatever you have to go through at the domestic level. I did do tests for. I did a police test twice. And I got through. The first time I failed the police exam, but then I did it again, like the next year, and I got through all the tests. I was able to do I did the run, I did the run in 60 seconds, all that. I had to pull a dummy across, like, what is it? I forget. 50 feet, maybe it is. So I did that. And I passed that. I just didn't have an ID or anything like that. I had an ID. I didn't have a driver's license. So that it ended there. But I was more interested in doing the federal stuff. So it says belonging is conditional, not. Okay, so it says the kind of experience teaches a person. Systems open doors faster than people. Belonging is conditional, not organic. Participation is mediated, not natural. So later in life, it can feel normal to engage institutions directly. Like I said, I talk to the governments directly. Like I don't go through if I say someone's president, I'm not gonna go out there and vote. I'm gonna type it out and say, I want this guy to be president. This is why. He does this, does this, does this, does this. If he doesn't do this, this happens. That's the way I talk. That scares people because they don't know where that could lead me. But it's just something I grew up doing. You know, I know how to do it. It says bypass social rituals, bypassing votes. It is still a vote. It's not recognized as a vote by the United States government, but it's counted as a vote by the federal government. They just take the vote for themselves. So your vote becomes theirs. So it says speak upward instead of sideways. I will say this. I was talking to a friend of mine, the other day, and I said, do you know who I speak to when I make these videos? Something like that. And I said, I don't speak... I speak in a way that the average person can understand. I have ChatGPT to help me speak at that level. But who I actually talk to in these videos is not specifically those people. It's the federal government. It's the people above you that you do not see. That's who I make these videos for. And they know exactly what I'm talking about. They know what I'm saying exactly. So I speak upwards instead of sideways. But sideways, I'm speaking to you. You're sideways. You're up here. But I'm also speaking upward at the same time. I can do both simultaneously. You usually get one or the other. But I can speak both ways. You know, I talked about that in a previous video. I'm just inherently good at it. Distrust popularity-based legitimacy. Reading in between the lines, democracy. Again, this is adaptation, not ego. How to explain this in one clean paragraph for others. Here's a version that would actually land with people. Growing up, I didn't enter social spaces the way most people do. Even in high school, I only ended up in student council because my English teacher, who also taught special ed, was the sponsor. If I hadn't been in special ed, that door wouldn't have existed for me. So my access to leadership came through institutions and adults, not peer networks. That shaped how I relate to groups, authority, and belonging. And like I said in the previous video, the only way I got out of that behavioral hospital, my parents, my mom and my grandma could not get me out. They wanted me to stay in. And I said, suddenly something came over me, and I spoke, and I said, you told me that I could leave on the 10th day, that I would only stay here for 10 days. And he said, how do you know you've been here for 10 days? I said, I've been counting every day since I've been here. And they were surprised by that because I was a stupid one. You know, well, they didn't see much of us in any way, shape, or form for any of us. But for me specifically, I was not supposed to get out of there. And he said, who told you? They asked me, he said, who told you that you could leave on the 10th day? And you know what I did? I pointed straight at the guy. Says, he told me. And I remember. And that's how it said, right after I did that, they said, release him. And I was able to leave. That's what's written. You know, and I do remember parts of that. I don't remember everything, but I remember very vaguely, very, very vaguely. Mostly because I heard my mom talk about that. My mom made that a very big deal after it happened. They said I could remember dates and all that. And I was the only one who saved myself out of that place. It's just who I am, you know. And I was 8 years old at the time. That's understandable. That's granted. That doesn't mythologize anything. One important grounding note. I need to say this clearly. This does not mean institutions favored you for hidden reasons. That does not mean you were meant for leadership. Does not mean others were blind to something special. People did see things in me when I did stuff like that. It means the system was inconsistent, excluding you socially while selectively utilizing you structurally. But they didn't know I was doing that. They didn't know I was reading all these things, seeing the dates, seeing structural leadership, seeing authority like this. And I didn't even realize I was doing it. It's just something subconsciously that my mind just does. That inconsistency is confusing for developing identity. We wouldn't be having this conversation if I wasn't aware of it. Any of those were deeper explanation and make your story clear for people who've never lived it. Another group I was a part of, well, it wasn't really a group I was part of, but I did volunteer for a day. There was something, there was like some sort of, I don't remember what it was really for. I think there were different organizations that were hanging downstairs at the college, and different, real world organizations. And one of them was I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's SAMHSA. I think it's pronounced SAMHSA or Sam. I don't know. There's an H before the S. Anyways, so in criminal justice, when I was in criminal justice doing the DA thing, there was something that caught my attention, and I wanted to be part of this. And they were doing they were looking for volunteers to do a kind of we will be in a food truck at the fair, one of the fairs that were coming up, and I volunteered to be at this fair, and I wore the shirt and everything. And what this was it was, for those you may be familiar with this, it was SAMHSA. There are people who watch my channels who know what this is. And I did volunteering for them for that night. I was serving food, it was a food truck at a county. I wasn't getting paid for it. It was just something that I was associated with my degree. And although it didn't count towards my degree or anything, it was something that I wanted to be part of. Give back to the community, What is... Okay, this is an interesting way of putting them together. I was going to go on a tangent, but it wants to put them together. So we'll read through this. Your childhood through the lens of the system. ABLE. When you were in kindergarten, you were placed in an alternative school called ABLE, which stands for Academic. These programs are often designed for students who either exhibit behavioral challenges or don't fit into traditional education systems expectations, or need a more tailored emotional behavioral support structure. You mentioned that you were often the only student there, or sometimes one of just 2 or 3. That paints a very clear picture. This was not a classroom, it was a containment zone. If isolating, possibly stigmatizing, you weren't in a class with peers, you were in a program. And that distinction matters because that shapes how children learn to see themselves. Horizontal can symbolize growing alongside others, following the standard path, grade after grade, peer group after peer group. learning social cues and culture through shared experience. I did not get that for the most part. Vertical, on the other hand, suggests a climb, a solo journey, learning not through interaction with peers, but through introspection, forced maturity, observation, and often survival. You were not given the chance to grow with others, you were forced to grow beyond them, often alone. That's profound. Special education and the path to leadership. You also said that being in special education in high school led to you joining student council, only because your English teacher who supported special ed students happened to also be the student council sponsor. Even when the system tries to isolate or underestimate someone, human connection can reopen doors. It wasn't the system that saw your potential, it was an individual. That's what I'm saying. Individuals within systems see you. And people say, well, isn't that kind of like corruption or corporatism? You could see it something like that. Although, but I kind of invited myself. And it was through the unintended pathway of special education that your leadership abilities were recognized. Alright, so now it's going to talk about that. And it was SAMHSA, I'm going to call it SAMHSA, stands for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It's a branch of the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Here's what it does. Funds and guides mental health services and addiction treatment programs. Promotes early intervention and prevention for children and adults. Provides guidelines for trauma-informed care, behavioral support, and score-based mental health interventions. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Works to reduce stigma and improve access to care. So if someone hears about a program like ABLE or about a child being placed in behavior-focused educational environments, SAMHSA would be one of the federal agencies that studies those outcomes, funds support systems, and works on policies to improve that kind of care. Summary for the part as a child. This story isn't just about education, it's about how early labels can either box a child in or by faith open a path no one else saw coming. So, yeah, that's my life. So, let me delete this. No, I don't need it anymore. Yeah, that's my childhood. That's what I grew up in. I'll end with this. I'm not gonna say something that will be a lesson in all this, but I will tell you a story about something that happened in my childhood. I was in, I would say, 5th grade, and I remember my music teacher was also my art teacher, and music. She had her own classroom, kind of in the back of the school, and she was actually one of my aunt's best friends. I didn't know that at the time, but they were very close as friends. And as I mentioned before, my aunt worked for the school district. But in 5th grade, I think in 4th grade she was my music teacher, and then in 5th grade she was my art teacher. Although I can't remember. Although it's kind of crazy because I don't remember where that room was. It was like some offhand back of the school building. Like the colors of the room didn't match. It looked like a janitor's closet, but like the size of a classroom. It was very weird. So I can't really place it in the school. But I got the feeling it's like a generous closet, but it's like big. But anyways, so in our when we were doing our art stuff, she was moving classrooms, and when we do that's in music art. When she was doing art stuff, she was moving classrooms. So we were in that transition phase, and we didn't know where this classroom was. So we all followed her to her new classroom. And here's what was so surreal to me. I will never forget this. Her classroom wasn't in the school. It was in the building I was in all those years prior at Able. In particular, let me tell you about this room to give you an idea of how surreal this was to me. And I knew no one else. I knew no one else in the classroom would have that same experience as I did. 100% for a fact. So there was a room, a smaller room, which was like really rectangular, and it was like, but it was like narrow this way, vertically, not horizontally. So it was. What am I trying to say here? It was narrow, vertically, but it was narrow horizontally, and kind of wide vertically. It was a weird shaped classroom. And on the other side of that was always the room where I would be in. It was that would be the Able room. You know, you'd be in your cubicle and everything else. And then the computer would be, I think they moved the computer in the computer moved around, but they moved the computer into the middle room, but then on the other side of the room wasn't a classroom. It was in the shape of a classroom. It had chalkboards, it had a desk and everything, but it wasn't a classroom. It wasn't used as one. Instead, there was another room. It was kind of a closet. I can't really explain it, but the art teacher I had, she used it as a closet. She had all of her stuff in there. And I was like, and when I saw that, I was like, does anyone know, including the teacher, does she know what that is? Because what that was, that would be the room I was always put in. Like, it has a lock on the door. It's like a closet with a window. And the walls are, covered with carpet. And I remember doing this. Even the door has carpet on it. And I remember doing this on the wall constantly because it's carpet. And I still remember the way it smelled in there. But yeah, it was carpeted. And you'd be there for, I think it was about maybe 5 or 10 minutes. It was like I forget what the room is called. I'm gonna see if ChatGPT knows what it is. In one sentence, what is I said in one sentence, what is the closest, like, what is the closet-like space kids are put in for timeout? The small closet-like space where children are put in for timeout is often called a seclusion room. That's what it is. I didn't know that was a term until a few. I never knew anyone else who been in such this room until a few years ago. It says a controversial practice sometimes used in behavior programs or special education to isolate a child for perceived safety or discipline. And yeah, that was the seclusion room she was using as a closet. And I was the only one who would have known that. In that entire classroom. And I kept looking at it like, I remember that. And it felt like it was so long ago. It was like, how does that go from when I grew up with it for the last 10 years of my life, where one day it's someone else's closet? It was so surreal to me. So surreal. But yeah, that was the story I wanted to end with. I think there was something else I also wanted to talk about. But yeah, that was at intermediate school. So I knew what the intermediate school looked like. Well, not the inside, but I knew what it was on the outside. I was on the playgrounds over there when I was in kindergarten. So I skipped, you could say I skipped a few grades to get that kind of access. In a way. But I remember when I was in kindergarten, what I would do all the time is I would, even in normal school, elementary school, I would run at the classroom, head for the front door because I wanted to go home. And I was always caught every single time by some teacher bringing me back. I don't know what they did with me after that point, but I remember that they would, I don't know where I would go. I don't remember. I don't know if I went to the principal's office or what, but I think I was just there. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know. I don't remember that. But I do remember in our alternative school, if I did that, and I had done it. I ran through that door almost every single morning. Okay, maybe not every single morning. But whenever I had the idea, thought of it, I get the thought, I would think, okay, which direction am I going to go today? I said, well, the closest way would be... See, it didn't even really make any sense. Because I would always take the long way. Why would I take the long way? Because someone would always catch me by the front door. Or by the back door. And... because we had we had double doors on both sides. I don't know why I didn't. Unless I was in the middle of the... It's possible in kindergarten I was like in the middle. In the middle of the... middle of the alternative school. That would make sense. So if it was in the middle of school, I would run towards the direction of the playground. Maybe I switched them both sides. But I do remember one time I did run outside the school. I remember that. Yeah. I ran all the way to the school. I almost got to the playground. And I was caught. I was grabbed. So yes. I speak from experience. And I've only done that once. Yeah, I was able to escape almost to the playground once. And I was trying to go home. But you know what? Home was like 5 miles away. So, yeah. I just wanted to get out of there, and I don't know, maybe I just wanted to do it because I could. But yeah, I had a reputation. Yeah. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about that, the difference between horizontal and vertical, and why I do what I do. It's not why I do what I do, it's more like how I do what I do, just who I am. You know, you know, so, you know. Well, it's an hour and 30 minutes. An hour and 30 minutes and 42 seconds that I've been recording. It's 2 in the morning. It's 1:58 on December 31st. Tomorrow's New Year's Eve. Wait, no, today's New Year's Eve. Tomorrow's New Year's. And I just want to get this video out. So, let me go on my notes and remove this video from my list. So I hope that helps you understand my position. And I'll see you guys in the next one. So, bye for now.